Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Parkland Institute's presentation this evening. My name is Bill Kilgannon. I'm the Executive Director of the Parkland Institute. As I say, we're happy to have so many people coming in and joining us tonight for this very important conversation on setting the right direction for post-secondary education in Alberta. Before we begin formally, Parkland Institute always likes to start our evenings with an acknowledgement that we are speaking to you today. I'm here on Treaty 6 territory, but I know some of our speakers are joining us this evening from Treaty 7 in the southern part of the province. And many people are joining as well from Treaty 8 in the north as well. So we acknowledge and honor all our ancestors, traditions, and spirit of the Indigenous people of this land, the Cree, Nakota, Dene, Blackfoot, and Métis. It is important to understand that we are all treaty people, and we need to take the calls to action laid out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to take action on that. And Parkland Institute and our board of directors has been doing a lot of work with respect to our own processes to recognize and take action on those calls to action. This evening is hosted by the Parkland Institute. We are proud to be members of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. For those who don't know, Parkland Institute is a political economy research institute. We do research and education for the public good is our main line. And this year we're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary. We're very excited about that. And the Parkland Institute is supported by individuals, organizations, unions. We don't actually receive any core funding from the university. We do get academic grants, but we do rely on all of you to support us. So if you do have the opportunity to contribute to Parkland Institute, we really appreciate it. I also want to let people know that we are going to be hosting our 25th annual conference coming up on November 19th to 21st. Of course, it's going to be a virtual conference. It's called Building the Future We Need. And we're really excited. We have a number of amazing keynote speakers. We have Pam Palmater on the first night, Indigenous lawyer, writer, activist. And then on Saturday, we have Kate Raworth, who is an economist from Oxford University, who wrote the very world-renowned book, Donut Economics. Labor economist Jim Stanford is speaking. And we're also excited that we have Maud Barlow is going to be having a conversation with young climate activists at our conference. So Maud Barlow being one of Canada's top longtime activists on issues related to water and climate change and world trade and stuff. And the conference closes with well-known Canadian Indigenous writer Alicia Elliott on Sunday as well. So we're very excited about that. The conference website should be up, we hope tomorrow or at the latest on Monday, and then people will be able to start registering. So as we go forward. This evening, we are hosting with our partners, the Confederation of Alberta Faculty Associations, the Council of Alberta University Students, the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, the Non-Academic Staff Association at the University of Alberta, and CUPE Alberta, and some of them are joining us tonight for this important conversation going forward. As I'm sure many of you know, since the UCP came to power in 2019, they have year after year done massive cuts to post-secondary education. They started a review and hired the McKinsey & Co. company to do a report, which we'll be talking about tonight. And of course, have come out with their 2030 plan. So on October the 5th, the Parkland Institute published Roadmap or Roadkill, a critical look at the government's strategy for post-secondary education in Alberta. We know that in the upcoming session of the legislature, the government is looking at changing the Post-Secondary Learning Act. And so we're very pleased to have joining us tonight. Our first two speakers are the authors of that report. I'll introduce both of them, and then they'll speak, and then afterwards we'll have representatives from the faculty, staff, and students speaking as well. But let's kick this off. I'll introduce our two speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them. Dr. Trevor Harrison is a professor of sociology at the University of Lethbridge. He was formerly the director of the Parkland Institute, of which he was also a founding member. He is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 9 books, numerous journal articles, chapters, and reports, and a frequent contributor to public media, including radio and television. With Trevor is Dr. Richard Mueller, who is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Lethbridge and academic director of the Lethbridge branch of the Prairie Regional Research Data Center. His research has been published in various economics, Canadian studies, and higher education journals, several edited volumes and reports, and highlighted by a number of media outlets.
Thanks so much, Bill. Welcome to everybody far and wide who's taking this in this evening. As Bill has mentioned, in this past April, the Alberta government released a report, Alberta 2030, Building Skills for Jobs. And that document laid out a 10-year strategy for transforming the province's post-secondary system. Alberta 2030 is purportedly based on a report commissioned by the Alberta government from McKinsey & Company at a cost of $3.7 million. As an aside, I would note that the company actually has a fairly checkered past and also really no past record of having worked on post-secondary institutions and education. But be that as it may, the fact is that report upon which the government's release is based has not been released, and we will be making some recommendations later here that are contained in our report. But one of those is, in fact, that that report be made public immediately. And so far it has not, despite a Freedom of Information request made by Parkland Institute some months ago now. So before I get into the what the government release actually says and our report, our response to it, a little historical context I think is useful here. Many of the ideas that are actually contained in Alberta 2030, when you go back to an earlier document back in the Klein days, seems to be kind of a retread of that earlier document. Back in 1994, the Alberta government under Premier Ralph Klein released a white paper, New Directions for Adult Learning in Alberta. That report came out, much as we see today, in the context of an economic downturn. So Alberta was in a crisis. And like Alberta 2030, New Directions detailed plans for increased tuition, more applied learning, and performance indicators, while also threatening collective bargaining and even hinting at doing away with tenure. Alberta and the system was in some sense saved fairly quickly because, of course, the price of oil rebounded. And that gave post-secondary a little bit of a respite. But again, thinking about what was contained in that report and what is now appears in Alberta 2030, we see kind of a recapitulation of many of those same ideas. The fact is we continue to have a lot of instabilities in the economy, and every time it happens, the post-secondary system seems to be at the forefront of facing many of those cuts and efforts to restructure post-secondary. As before, the current government has embarked on a path for its institutions that involves massive funding cuts, exorbitant tuition increases, and changes to governance that we'll be getting into here that makes post-secondary institutions less accountable to Albertans. Unfortunately, Albertans should not, and likely cannot, rely upon another boom to save us once again. I realize that in fact the price of oil has been going up in the last while, and one can imagine that the eyes of government leaders are sugar plums are dancing in them at the moment. But this again will be only a brief respite. And one of our arguments made is that, in fact, post-secondary could play a real role in the transformation of Alberta and its economy that is necessarily going to happen. In fact, Alberta 2030 contains many things that should concern all Albertans. To be blunt, Alberta 2030 is ill-advised and even dangerous. If implemented, its direction will have a radical and negative impact on Alberta's post-secondary system. Much of Alberta 2030 follows from the release of the McKinnon report, about which my colleague will be speaking shortly. That report was released in 2019, and it contained many misleading statistics on the costs of post-secondary education in Alberta. But the fact is the government has used those same misleading stats to justify its actions ever since. Alberta 2030 lays out 6 goals along a potentially harmful path. And in our report, we go through each one of those in some detail. Taken together, though, those 6 goals mean the costs of post-secondary education will rise for students and their families, even as access to seats becomes limited and the number and quality of educational programs is decreased. Alberta post-secondary participation rate already, students in this province, our participation rate is extremely low, especially for 18 to 24-year-olds, and much, much less, for example, than Ontario. At the same time as Alberta Education's own figures show that there is going to be an increase of some 40,000 students by 2028. Alberta 2030 says nothing about how it's going to deal with this influx of new students into the system. It means Alberta 2030 really reducing education to immediate job training and not preparing students for a full and meaningful role in the new economy that is rapidly emerging for us. It means tying post-secondary institutions even more to the business community's own very special interests. It means continued financial instability for post-secondary institutions, leading, we believe, in fact, our figures show this, I think, clearly, to a serious drain in support of support staff and faculty. Finally, Alberta 2030 means centralizing even more power in the hands of the Minister of Advanced Education, a select group of party insiders, and corporate executives. With those comments, I'm going to turn over to my colleague to take us through some of the statistical financial information that disproves what the government is attempting to do. Take it away, Rick.
Thank you, Trevor. So our report basically has a significant amount of data, but here I'm going to try to focus on some of the data that's most important or relevant for our purposes. And so I start with what the McKinnon report actually said about post-secondary finances in Alberta. Our report begins by critically examining the data from this McKinnon report. That report, released in 2019, as Trevor mentioned, has been used to justify government policy decisions sort of ever since. It purports to show that Alberta spent between $5,000 and $15,000 more per FTE, which is full-time equivalent student, than the 3 comparator provinces of BC, Ontario, and Quebec. While that report's data are difficult to replicate, I couldn't do it, however, and as a result may provide an apples, what we try to do is provide an apples-to-apples comparison of the actual costs of education per full-time equivalent student in each jurisdiction. And so we use Statistics Canada data, not perfect, but I could, StatsCan goes to great efforts to make their data comparable between the provinces. So what we do is look at the StatsCan data, look at the expenditures by province, as well as Canada-wide, to come up with an accounting of costs that are likely more accurate than those provided in the McKinnon report. Well, why is this? Well, the McKinnon report basically aggregates all PSIs, or post-secondary institutions, in Alberta and the other provinces, and then makes the comparison. And we think this is really misleading. So the next figure shows the cost per student in community colleges and vocational schools in Alberta, Canada-wide, and in the comparator provinces. So these data are from 2000 fiscal years, I guess 2000 to 2001 through 2018-19. Those are the latest. That's the latest year for which data are available. And sort of keep in the back of your mind through all this that this is sort of the beginning of the cuts. So we kind of expect these numbers to have changed once StatsCan releases the official data. What we basically find is Alberta has much higher per capita expenditures than her comparators. And this has been the case over the entire period. Again, this is mainly for colleges. So here we do agree with the McKinnon report that many small institutions in the province do have higher per student costs. And I'll come back to that point in a couple minutes. Now, this isn't to suggest that these institutions should be necessarily targeted, since there are a lot of economic and social arguments to keep these small, rural, largely rural institutions open, even if they do have higher costs per student. So if we go to the next figure, it paints quite a different picture. This is just for sort of universities and what the StatsCan calls degree granting colleges, the blue line here. And we really don't see a lot of difference between universities in Alberta and the other jurisdictions, especially recently. And again, this is before the cuts that the Kane government has instituted since that period of time. So if we kind of take a look at this holistically, it's the colleges where there seems to be arguably a problem in the McKinnon report, but not necessarily the universities. We seem to be pretty comparable to those universities. And I'll dig a little bit deeper into these numbers in a minute here. So while Alberta does have higher costs for students compared to Ontario, Quebec in this graph here, as well as the Canadian average, they're lower than British Columbia, at least for the most recent year for which data are available, which is 2018-19. But even when they are higher, Alberta's costs are not nearly as high as suggested by the McKinnon report, and the differences have likely shrunk again since the government of Alberta has embarked on recent cuts. So where are these costs involved? And this is another figure right out of the report here. What do we find basically? Well, if we take a look at these numbers here, if they're more than 100, this is just a comparison between Alberta costs per full-time equivalent student and our comparators, which are Canada, of course, Canada-wide, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. In the academic ranks, these numbers more than 100 basically mean that the comparators spent more on these items per FTE than Alberta did. So here we see, of course, that all the jurisdictions, with the exception of Ontario, spent more on the academic ranks per full-time equivalent student than we did in Alberta. Where's the problem? Well, we'll basically see that these numbers are less than 100, which means Alberta spent more than these other jurisdictions. So sort of with the exception, so this is other instruction and research, other salaries and wages. And again, we kind of do agree with the McKinnon report that some administrative costs are involved in these numbers, the most recent numbers that we just sort of see here. And so this might be where the problem lies. I'm not saying where the problem lies, but this is certainly worthy of investigation, I think. McKinnon report did discuss high administration costs, and those appear to be reflected here. So if we do kind of the same thing for community colleges and vocational schools in the next slide here, which is Appendix E in the report, these numbers are all much less than 100, which means that Alberta spent more per FTE than our comparators. And all these numbers are less than 100, and some of them quite significantly so. So this seems to be where the problem, if it is a problem, in fact, again, there are other social and economic development goals that some of these smaller institutions are trying to fulfill, and they have. What I want to do next is take a closer look at some of these data from Alberta Advanced Education, and they give us a broader view of which institutions have high per FTE expenditures overall. We do expect what we call the CARU institutions, which are the comprehensive academic and research universities, to have higher expenditures. So what we see here, if you kind of look at the red line that is highlighted in the middle there, that's the median cost per FTE back in 2018 and 19. To the left of there, of course, we're below the median, and to the right, we're above the median. Well, we kind of expect the CARU institutions, of course, being comprehensive academic and research universities, to have these higher per FTE costs. I mean, a lot of professional schools, very expensive programs, engineering, dentistry, you name it, in there. And sure enough, our three of the CARUs, Lethbridge, Calgary, and Alberta, are to the right of the median, but 7 of these institutions to the right of the median are colleges, basically. And what's interesting here, if you look at the parentheses at the bottom, these are all very small institutions. My high school, when I graduated way too many years ago now, was bigger than these institutions are today. And so these are very, very small, okay? And all of these colleges, because they're servicing these rural areas, have more than one campus, all of them, and they service the remote areas of the province. And all of them also were either established in the 1960s or expanded in the 1960s, and again, partially for economic development reasons. This sort of points to where any potential issues may lie. And again, we're not saying that we should be cutting back on these institutions necessarily, but let's be realistic in our data and see exactly where the costs per FTE differ. So these data that I just presented, as well as other in our report, show that the PSE system in Alberta is not financially much different than other jurisdictions, perhaps with the exception of some of these small rural colleges, once we make these apples to apples comparisons. What's also interesting, and you'll find this in the report if you've read it or if you want to read it, is survey results from employers and students that were conducted by Alberta Advanced Education, and this is in their annual report, show that both groups are generally satisfied with the system as it is. Very high rates of satisfaction, both amongst employers and students that are graduating from the system. We agree certainly that the system could be made better, but Alberta 2030, in our opinion, does not do that. Our recommendations are done in the spirit of strengthening what's already a world-class post-secondary experience for students and one that's currently respected by employers. So back to you, Trevor.
Thank you, Rick. As Rick has mentioned, our report is based on not only critiquing what the government has produced in its release, but also trying to provide some positive ways forward, that some things we think actually could be done to strengthen the post-secondary system and to really prepare it better for the kind of economy that we'll have in future, and for the opportunities of students and their families and communities. So we've made a number of recommendations. I'm going to go through each one of those with some detail here. One of the first things is that we're calling for fulsome reinvestment in public funding for post-secondary institutions. We recognize fully that Alberta is facing some economic challenges, but we also think that the post-secondary system could play a real role in rebuilding the Alberta economy and building it, preparing it for the new economy, while also preparing, as I mentioned before, for the predicted demographic increase in the next number of years. Some 40,000 students, again, to remind you, coming through by 2028. Our report notes the singularly poor record of government and business in predicting the shape of future labor markets, especially when they focus narrowly on the types of jobs and not the skills and abilities required to perform in the future economy. This seems is the case in a lot of jurisdictions, but it seems especially true in Alberta, where successive governments have attempted to shape the role of post-secondary institutions in the service of the oil and gas industry, and have failed miserably, actually, to prepare the students for the coming changes that are happening. The world economy and the labor market is changing rapidly, and our report notes, quoting the government's own figures, that Alberta faces this major demographic shift. And again, so we're calling for fulsome spending, increases in spending, to actually accommodate the kind of things that post-secondary requires. The second one of our recommendations is for a new model of democratic and collegial governance that strengthens the role of faculty, of staff, of students, and the community at large in decision-making, while limiting the influence of corporate special interests and the centralized authority of the government. Government documents point to plans to create a strategic advisory council made up of individuals appointed by the minister, drawn from a mix of, quotes, industry and employers, and various so-called experts in higher adult education, but none of them actually affiliated with educational institutions or residing in Alberta. In other words, what they want to do is create a business-friendly environment for their supporters. Third, a new model of post-secondary education based on free tuition for the first 2 years of full-time undergraduate education. What we argue would be a new Alberta advantage and an improved system of grants and loans. Such a model would retain and attract new students, especially from the Indigenous and other historically marginalized communities, into the system and provide genuine benefits for the economy and society as a whole. I will say here that we did not just pull this idea out of a hat. In fact, this is a pretty common practice in European countries where students find their tuitions are paid in full. And the way the system works is you don't pay at the front end, you pay afterwards, because we know that highly educated people earn more salaries. And so they pay through the tax system, a kind of pay it forwards to other people who are coming along. And we think this system would revolutionize education in Alberta and in Canada as a whole, as we believe it may in fact well be copied. The fourth thing that we are actually calling for is increased government transparency and accountability. As mentioned earlier, the McKinsey report, for which Albertans paid $3.7 million, has not been released. All Albertans have a stake in the financing and governance of the province's post-secondary system. It is critical that all stakeholders be aware of how decisions have been made on their behalf in order for students, their parents, faculty and staff, and the community at large to hold governments accountable and responsible to the electorate who have put them in office. We therefore call upon the immediate release of that report and all related documents pertaining to Alberta 2030. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Rick, for an amazing report and for presenting tonight. We're now going to call on a representative from each of the faculty, student, and staff to say a few words. I'm next going to call upon Dr. Kevin Kane. Kevin is the chairperson, or the president, I should say, sorry, of the Confederation of Alberta Faculty Associations. He's currently a professor in the Department of Medical Microbiology and Immunology in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta.
Thanks, Bill. So we very much laud a number of points that Parkland has raised in this report. And as far as steps to go forward, for example, the significant reinvestment in post-secondary education, we agree is extremely important, especially if we're going to develop a new economy going forward. And we're concerned, obviously, about the livelihoods of Albertans. At least some of that is based on also the fact that the McKinnon report was seriously flawed in its analysis, as we've seen tonight already. And another thing is that the accounting practices of the provincial government make it such that there are expenditures we make for research, for example, that account as a black mark actually in their overall accounting, which is highly unusual. This is an Alberta problem. Most cases are that the university operating budgets are not, certainly research budgets, for example, are not included in the provincial ledger. That's one thing. Another thing is I do want to point out when there are increases in investment in PSC, this is extremely helpful for the economy in that we know from a study for the University of Alberta, for example, for every dollar that's invested in the university, there's $12 of economic activity that result from that. And I'm sure the other institutions in Alberta are making similar contributions. So imagine what we could have if, as Parkland suggests, that we have a significant increase in funding at PSEs. So another thing is that Alberta 2030, I do want to point out about the title. It says skills for jobs. And this has been raised, but I want to elaborate on it a little bit. And that is that it was clear because faculty and students, and of course, corporate representatives and so on, had some input with respect to, at least on consultation for Alberta 2030. We could see that no matter what kind of contributions we made, no matter how good the arguments were, or how logical they were, and so on, that from the very beginning, it was skills for jobs. And that meant really training for, in the short term, strictly for commercial interest, very narrow interests. And those interests were to simply have PSE substitute for the typical onboarding training that occurs at corporations and companies. That says that there was no understanding by the government as to the purpose of a post-secondary education. And that is to develop people such that they have significant career options. Now, notice the difference. Career options, so that they would have skills that would last an entire career, whether they move jobs and so on. And these would be excellent communication skills. These would be critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, and skills for lifelong learning. And we could find that that was utterly lost in our consultations. And it was all about short-term commercial interest. And the thing is that for our young people in Alberta, that's shortchanging them. In the future, have to think differently than Alberta 2030, that's for sure. Another thing I want to point out is in the consultations for Alberta 2030, and one of the nice things that we see with the Parkland report is that the whole idea of research. One of the things that Alberta 2030 really wants is that if you're going to spend research money, they want it to be spent on immediate needs of corporations and companies for their near-term interests. This means that basically you're stealing money, if you will, from the logical place where funding is normally placed, and that is in the fundamental research that leads to breakthroughs that then puts your province in a very good strategic position, because you have developments that can bypass and be highly competitive on a global basis based on basic research. So that fundamental research. And so what you need is both. You need basic research, and you need that last translational step, typically either before it gets to a company or at a company. But basically, we were robbing the research realm of the basic pipeline research for short-term commercial gain. And that would weaken our long-term economic viability in the province. Another thing is touching on governance. And I'm glad that this was raised not only in the report, but also tonight already. And that is, it is absolutely the case that what we could see was the minister wanted to have a small clique on this advisory council. And I think it was going to have 9 members. And as was mentioned, most of them had nothing to do with post-secondary education. And in fact, this was basically corporations advising the government as to what they wanted the government to do for them. And so again, that's not in the best interests of all Albertans, only a very minor subset. The alternative model, which we support, and that's put forward by Parkland, is that you have local governance have a strong say. So in other words, within the institutions, the faculty, staff, and students have significant input on how things are done on the campuses. Interesting addition was the idea that that group would have input on budgets, because so often what's happening is that there's a lot of input directly from the government, for example, as to how expenditures occur on campuses. And this is very problematic, because people on the ground, as we all know better with respect to how things are operating. And so there has to be input at that level that's significant. One last thing is something called deconsolidation. This is where there's the possibility that the universities and colleges would become more independent from the government. As you can see, there's plenty of reasons for that from what I've already mentioned. And another thing is that this problem with budgets could potentially be solved with more independence for the institutions, because the government would not be able to manipulate things as much as they are now. And also some of those peculiarities of accounting that I mentioned, because of the institutions being part of the government itself, that would end, which would be helpful. In fact, in other jurisdictions, that's the way it is with universities and colleges.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We really appreciate all the faculty associations across the province supporting the research and the work that we're doing and having this conversation with us tonight. So next, I would like to ask Rachel Timmerman. She is the chair of the Council of Alberta University Students. So that's all Mount Royal, MacEwan, U of A, U of C, U of L, Athabasca. And she's also the VP External at Mount Royal University in Calgary. So take it away, Rachel.
Thank you, Bill. As was mentioned, my name is Rachel Timmermans, and I'm the chair of the Council of Alberta University Students and the Vice President External of the Students Association of Mount Royal University. CAUS represents 140,000 undergraduate students at Alberta's 6 large public universities. And I would like to thank Parkland and its partners for inviting me to participate in the panel this evening. It shouldn't be news to most people that a post-secondary education, whether it's from a university, a college, or a polytechnic institute, is expensive. Alberta does have some of the highest tuition and mandatory fees in the country, namely because institutions started charging mandatory non-instructional fees as an indirect route to raise tuition revenues. However, these are not the only costs that students face over the course of their education. Regardless if you're living in a large city or in a smaller community, costs such as rent, food, transportation, required supplies for a program, as well as textbooks, can also create a large financial barrier for many Albertans. While the student financial aid system in Alberta will fund a student's assessed need and provide funds to fill that need, the portion of funding that comes from grants versus loans has not been maintained with inflating costs. That is to say, students are now receiving a lower portion of their funding from scholarships, grants, and awards, with a larger portion of their financial aid coming from loans. Unfortunately, as of 2015, which is the most recent data from Statistics Canada, the average undergraduate student will graduate with over $30,000 in debt. Given that the current government policy on tuition is to allow it to increase by 22.5% over 3 years, students are concerned that their debt level upon graduation will grow to a value that is overly burdensome on them and the young families that we're all trying to establish. The government of Alberta should be very concerned with the debt level that students are graduating with. This debt fundamentally removes funds out of the economy and as well creates larger risk for the government, with students more likely to default on payments. Now, some people may say that students should enroll in programs and classes that they know will lead to well-paying jobs. Unfortunately, there are many sectors in our economy that require skilled labor that greatly benefits our society, but are not well compensated. As a simple example, many people require childcare and they want high quality, well-trained professional staff looking after their children. However, this essential work is not always well compensated. It is very important to remember that the purpose of a college, university, or polytechnic institute is not to simply provide us with job training, but to provide us with critical thinking skills, as well as the skills to synthesize new information, new parameters, and adapt ways to best address it. It is these skills that will fundamentally drive our economy. Innovation happens when smart, intelligent individuals use their problem-solving and critical thinking skills to find new ways to achieve success. Without those skills, people will only be repeating what they were taught to do. Since Alberta universities should not be providing direct corporate onboarding training, it is concerning that it appears that students could be paying a post-secondary institution for what is currently being provided by employers. All that this effectively accomplishes is transferring the cost of onboarding new staff away from businesses and corporations and onto their prospective employees, students. There is also concern that similar programs may not be accepted by different employers, where the employer may require a specific class from a specific institution, for example. This additionally harms students and the Alberta taxpayer as a funder of our post-secondaries, as they will have to pay multiple times for effectively the same content, but from different institutions. The whole point behind Alberta's post-secondary education system, with our rural college network, our polytechnics, and universities, is to allow citizens multiple pathways so that they can achieve their educational goals. This means that a person in Slave Lake should be able to enroll and upgrade their classes, then enroll in a 4-year degree program that transfers to a large institution, and maybe even continue for graduate studies. Alberta's undergraduates strongly support the principle of access to a post-secondary education, regardless of where one is located, their financial means, or their current educational attainment. With that, there is also a need to increase the size of various programs throughout the province. Class sizes have not always kept pace with our population growth, and it has created wait lists for students wanting to access specific programs. This is especially important when you recognize the number of young people that are coming up through our K-12 system and the enrollment implications that it will have when they reach post-secondary. The most effective way that this can be achieved, not just the needed program enrollment growth, but also the support students require, is for the government of Alberta to invest funds into post-secondary education. Over the last number of years, the Alberta government has taken hundreds of millions of dollars out of the post-secondary system and the student financial aid system. Both of these cuts fundamentally hurt the student experience and have had a detrimental impact on student academics. Fundamentally, costs for education have increased and services provided on campus, be it a writing support center or even just access to departmental staff or our professors, has decreased. Students are now paying for more and receiving less than they were 4 years ago. This has caused students to take on additional jobs to pay for their education, which means that they have less time to dedicate to their studies and less time dedicated to honing their craft. The non-academic staff at our institutions are essential for all students and not just faculty members. Frontline services such as department offices and lab assistants are provided by non-academic staff. Students are concerned about the job losses at our institutions and the further impacts to our education. There is strong evidence to show that the return on investment from a post-secondary education for a government is threefold. For every dollar that the government puts in, $3 is returned. Not only do educated individuals typically earn more in wages and consequently typically pay more in taxes, which is good for the government coffers. Additionally, evidence shows that a better educated population is less likely to need services provided by the government, such as healthcare, both emergency and preventative, as well as a decreased need to rely on social welfare programs, including policing costs. So not only will the government make more money, their expenses will decrease as well, just by educating the populace. The more young people we are able to educate, the better the province will be fiscally, economically, and socially. In conclusion, the best thing that the government can do for our economy is to invest in students, invest in our post-secondary system, and invest in the future of Alberta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really wonderful and so powerful to have the voice of students and the leadership that you're providing in talking about the direction of what way we should be moving forward with our post-secondary education system. Next, I would like to invite up Prachi Mishra. Prachi is the vice chair of AUPE Local 52, which is the union that represents non-academic staff at the University of Alberta. Prachi told me she used to work at the University of Alberta and was very involved in the U of A's non-academic staff association, NASA. But due to the cuts that the UCP brought in, the budget cuts, she actually lost her position, but fortunate to be at the University of Calgary now.
Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you to the Parkland Institute for having me. As Bill mentioned, I'm the vice chair of AUPE 52, which is the Union for Non-Academic Staff at the University of Calgary. And yes, was formerly also a part of the Non-Academic Staff Association at the University of Alberta. I think what is so clearly evident in this Alberta 2030 report is what it excludes and what it fails to acknowledge or mention. And one very obvious answer is non-academic staff. It's as if non-academic staff are invisible or don't play a role in anything that's going on with the envisioning of a future for post-secondary, in helping make students into building their skills for job creation and such. Although I obviously very strongly disagree in this idea of the university just pumping out workers, and also what role they play with faculty in envisioning what post-secondary education would look like. So it's just not even there. And the irony of that is that when these budget cuts came hand in hand with also the release of the reports and the restructuring of post-secondary education in Alberta as we know it, who were the first that were affected? It was the non-academic staff. So when the first budget cuts came around, both the University of Calgary and the University of Alberta, their first reaction was to eliminate staff. So in February 2021, the University of Calgary reported, in their February 2021 budget, the University of Calgary reported that 600 full-time positions were cut. That doesn't include part-time positions, fixed-term positions, hourly wage positions, or attritions as well. So that number is significantly more. And we all know what happened at the University of Alberta, where the very first reaction was 1,000 positions cut, and even more that came later down the line. So what we've seen is these job losses that have happened so significantly and dramatically, but in such a small amount of time, and with no time to think about how this has impacted the lives of non-academic staff. And remember, these cuts were happening in the midst of a pandemic, the peak of the pandemic, where people needed their jobs more than ever. So it's I can't quite convey to you the ruthlessness of this experience. And the University of Calgary and the University of Alberta can expect more budget cuts down the line. So what will that mean for non-academic staff? So what we need to really start thinking about is what role do non-academic staff play in an alternative vision for post-secondary education, and what fundamentally needs to change that any budget cuts doesn't automatically equal the loss of staff. That anything that happens to the university needs to include the voices, not only the voices, but the significant role of non-academic staff in decision-making, in collegial governance, in what have you, that no longer can non-academic staff remain silent when they are really in some ways being affected the most in the loss of livelihoods and jobs. So that's, I think, what we need to start really considering in an alternative vision. Where do non-academic staff fit within that role? And it really means giving them an active role in decision-making, because that's where we see people with power, is being able to have their voices heard and decisions being made by the university, for its students and for its faculty and staff. So that includes not only just the seats in General Faculties Council. We need to start thinking about governance where non-academic staff are not just non-voting members on subcommittees, where they actually have very important things to say and very valuable things to say, particularly in things around, say, for example, facilities development, and staff who are there day in and day out, whose its jobs to look at how this campus functions. They have knowledge in that area. Why aren't we giving them voting positions or acknowledging their knowledge and their experience? And when we think about what the role of non-academic staff is, it really is from the moment that a student is first accepted by enrollment, their applications are accepted as for whatever type of student they become in the university. And to the very end, when they walk the stage for convocation and they have non-academic staff there supporting them. And a little unknown fact is many non-academic staff actually volunteer to support students during convocation in the organization of it. The irony is not lost on me that non-academic staff play such a prominent role within not only the day-to-day operations of this university, but really what the university fundamentally stands for. Again, and the other irony that is not lost on me either is that a report focused on job creations and building skilled workers also came in hand with budget cuts that led to the losses of jobs. So this is the kind of difficult situation that non-academic staff really struggle in. And there's this notion that non-academic staff just come for their 9-to-5s and they're done, and that's all that the university means to them. But that's really not the case. We work at the university because we care about the university. We care about its students, we care about its faculty, and we are there to make this vision actually happen. So we would be the backbone of the university, that we're carrying out many of the things that faculty and students, can't necessarily carry out, whether in terms of advising or whether in terms of workers in IT or in cleaning. That's the role where and the heart of where non-academic staff really are. Moving from the question of where non-academic staff fit in an alternative vision for post-secondary, let's focus on what the results of these budget cuts are on non-academic staff today, because it's a very tangible and lived reality of thousands of people. With a smaller working force, non-academic staff are struggling under an increased workload. The universities want to make up for budget cuts by increasing student enrollment, but without any increased staff to support that and make that happen. So staff, both at the University of Calgary and at the University of Alberta, have been moved into hubs where instead of playing a specialized role in assisting students, now you're answering hundreds of emails with a smaller group of people. And the frustration isn't lost on anyone that students are waiting to hear back and staff are trying to keep up with the workload, and it's just too much. Cuts to IT, cuts to grounds and cleaning services has meant that the University of Calgary and Alberta have had to lower their cleaning standards to really quite dingy levels. And for billion-dollar institutions, that wouldn't be acceptable standard. Speaking of cleaning services, we can't even begin to talk about collegiate governance, a democratic institution, without talking about how the most marginalized members of these communities are actually treated, which are the caretakers, which are usually newcomer women of color, and they're invisible. It's as if they don't exist. Moving forward from that, when we are faced under such horrible working conditions, I really want to end off on an important note of how do we move forward from that? And what we do is by organizing, by looking at direct action as an alternative means. Some of you may have heard about the University of Calgary's bookstore was under the threat of privatization. And it was supposed to happen earlier this year, actually, where the University of Calgary decided because of the budget cuts, we would just have to privatize our bookstore, give it away to a private company, which would mean increased textbook costs for students, which would mean faculty wouldn't have that intimate connection with staff there to support them, staff who had been there for a long time to support them in choosing the right textbooks and so on and so forth. So last year, that was what staff at that bookstore were facing, AUPE 52 members. What they did, they got together, they collectively organized. We were on Zoom calls every week figuring out what do we want and how do we get there. And it's all the credit goes to the staff there who determined that we want to fight back against this privatization. Here's what we're willing to do. We're willing to put out pamphlets. We're willing to push forward and go to the president even at that level and let him know that this is what's happening. And as a result of that direct action, as a result of that organizing, that was at times was confrontational and aggressive, wasn't just please give us our rights. It was we are demanding those rights. And as a result, that privatization was stopped for another year and halted. So it's maybe not a complete victory, but it is a small little bit of inspiration in what is very dreary times for post-secondary education, that there are ways you can win. And that's not by asking, and that's not even just by demanding, it's by acting on those demands and be willing to be confrontational and do what needs to be done for you to secure your rights and to stop asking for your freedom, but just go get it. So that's something that I would like to echo to, regardless of the fact if you're faculty or non-academic staff or students, that's a strategy in which we move forward to creating an alternative vision for post-secondary education. There's no alternative for direct action and collective actions.
Thank you so much, Prachi. I really appreciate how at the end you talked about, just not sitting back and taking it, but actually setting the direction, which is really a big part of this theme tonight. It's up to us as citizens and activists in the community to figure out what road we want to be on and how we're going to set that direction going forward. So wonderful to have you joining us tonight. And I know in speaking with Jillian Pratt, the president of the Non-Academic Staff Association, they're feeling so much the same need for organizing at the U of A, including some of the others. I was speaking with some folks with CUPE Alberta, the president of Red Deer College, Non-Academic Staff Association. All over this province, the non-academic staff are really bearing the brunt of this, but also then leading that fight back that's so important. So we have had a few questions come in already. One of the questions that we see in the list is from Kevin Barry. Kevin asks, he says, with the popularity, I think you might mean, Kevin, the unpopularity of the current government, what types of pressures do you think are necessary to punt this decision to the curb? Alberta's post-secondary education system has been notorious for asking, but not really acting and getting the results that post-secondary needs, unlike other areas that are going on. So maybe I'll start with you, Trevor.
This is a time to certainly keep up the pressure on the government. This is a deeply wounded government at the moment. The projections are correct. They're a year and a half out from an election. They could, of course, postpone it another year. But you can see already they're squirming a bit because they've been thrown off their what they had hoped to do when they came in 2019. The economy is not rebounding. The pandemic has thrown a real monkey wrench into that. And I think the settlement that we saw the other day with AUPE is the beginning of a series of settlements with various institutions and unions. So my prediction, actually, and I will try to, please don't hold me to this if it doesn't come true, but I think actually we may see some changes by the budget time sometime in the spring. That doesn't mean the real threats to post-secondary are not still there. But I do think the government is running scared, and this is a time to press them even more. One of the things I would actually caution all of us in post-secondary to watch for, and this includes administrations, is that beyond the transitory issues of the economics, the finances, and these are real and they're important, but we have to be cautious that some of the deep structural changes that the government is planning don't come about in such a way as to harm post-secondary down the road. So whether the money comes back quickly, or we kind of keep moving along in the same way, those structural changes that we talk about in the report are the ones that fundamentally could change what post-secondary looks like in this province. So I think that, that's kind of a roundabout way of answering the question, but I do think certainly the government is wounded. And this is really a time for all stakeholders in the systems. And let me say here, actually, thanks to Kevin, Rachel, and Prachi for all of their comments, because taken together, I think what this shows is post-secondary is a community. And we all function, we all need each other. And it's really time for all of us to pull together and push the government back against some of the strategies and the policies that they're proposing here.
Thanks, Trevor. In the chat of Prachi, there's a battle going on between the U of C and the U of A over you, and the U of A wants you back, and the U of C saying they can't have you back. And so it's nice to be loved from both cities. So
I'm going to blush. I wish they'd stop. I would say that, and just emphasizing on Trevor's notion that the university is a community, it just goes to show that there's so much collegiality and so much love in between, staff and faculty and students across the two different universities. Rivalry put aside, the friendly rivalry put aside. From that sense of community, you really need to let it turn into radical action. I think sometimes post-secondary education, it can be, depending on the nature of the work itself, if you're not like a classic union place where your boss is being horrible to you and that's what drives you to get mad because you have that really tangible impact. Whereas in post-secondary, you're kind of lost in between reports and committees and this and that. And you forget that very basic notion that there's somebody out there who is treating you horribly. And you deserve better in that. And that's what happened. And I'm emphasizing the University of Calgary bookstore again, because that's what the staff did. They saw that happening to them and they fought back against it and they organized together. And they were, again, willing to be confrontational and willing to push forward, not even just demanding, but pushing forward direct action in things of putting out pamphlets, putting out Zoom backgrounds, and openly calling on the university and saying, this is what you're doing, show your face to the rest of the community that you serve. This is what you're doing to our staff. There has to be a way in which collegiality does not mean being nice to to those in power. There's a way in which collegiality can still allow you to be confrontational, can still allow you to pursue radical action. And it really does have to start, and it has to be member-led. So whether it's students, this is coming from someone in the position of an elected position within the union, it's not reaching out to your elected officials and asking them, what should I do? It's that, but it's also like, I'm going to do this, and you as my elected official will need to respond to that. And I'm doing that, right? So that's, I think, something that could apply to across, faculty, students, staff. That's a way in which you can do direct action, collective organizing. That grassroots work is amongst your colleagues. If you're part of a particular faculty as a student and you notice something's happening, doing that, or if you're within a particular location at a work site in a union, organizing amongst your colleagues, that's definitely a place to start.
Thanks, Prachi. We have a number of other questions. One is the current post-secondary system is increasingly relying on the low-paid labor provided by graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and sessional instructors to provide undergraduate teaching, while tenured positions are declining. So I'd be interested to hear more about how this issue can be addressed in the future. So I'm going to throw this one to you, Kevin, because I think that seems like a natural one for you to take on, if you could.
This has been a problem, unfortunately, not only in Alberta, but across Canada and across North America. So we are not unique in this problem. One of the things I will say as far as value to make sure that you have a substantial cohort of tenured faculty is, it's manyfold, but one of them is the tenured faculty can speak out. They're relatively protected, let me put it that way, compared to some of the more precarious instructors. So you have to have that ability to speak out when either the government or the institution is going off the rails. Another thing that's vital as far as having a large cohort of regular tenure stream faculty is how much it benefits the students. And I'll give you an example of it. And that is that if you're a tenured professor, you've been working in an area for 25 years, and you're an expert globally on it, and you can go to first-year students and you can inspire them because of your most recent research results. It can make all the difference for their career development, and that's vital for us in Alberta. So that's another reason to do that. And I'll tell you, in my first year chemistry class, I had a Nobel laureate present me, the basics of chemistry. And so you can imagine, for example, what a difference that makes with respect to how you approach things. So that's maybe an extreme example, but you get the idea. So, but the other thing too is we have superb sessional instructors. These are people also who have potentially had significant years of service at universities, and they quietly go about their business and they're seriously underpaid. They too are inspiring people and so on. So I think one of the things we've been trying to work towards is to stabilize those positions and improve them such that you have a good spectrum of types of instructors for our students. One of the things I can tell you is there are plenty of sessional instructors who many have a much closer relationship with the students with respect to the immediate instruction that is sometimes more difficult than the full professor who's running many different things at once. That all benefits the students. This is extremely important. And I think we're pushing from the inside for that. But I think if parents of our students, our students can be ambassadors to the public, can reinforce that with the public, that's such that there's pressure on universities as well as the government to properly fund, support, and so on, this full spectrum of instructor types. So I don't know, I hope that sort of answered that question.
If I can just add to what Kevin said here, I think it's quite true that you sometimes have some very qualified academics who are fortunate enough to get tenure. You also have a lot of precarious workers now who are very, very skilled young people who can't get in there. And I think one of the real dangers of what is going on here, and it's also elsewhere, is that a lot of people are going to say, why should I put myself through all those years of training? And at the end of the day, I can't even make enough money to buy a house or take care of a family. So we're going to start to lose a lot of people. And in this province, one of the things we warn about in the report is really brain drain. And that's going to come in the form of academics who leave here because they see no opportunities, because they're going to be treated like plebeian teachers teaching way too much and never getting to do research. And you're going to see it in students leaving. Students are going to leave because sometimes they're attracted to universities where they know there's particularly really good instructors, really good academics there, and they're going to suddenly disappear. Students develop relationships with their professors over time where it does, again, back to that community notion that you have this relationship with these people. But when you have precarious employees who are looking, again, they get a couple of courses this year to teach, but they have to go elsewhere. And so they disappear to another institution. Well, it breaks that magic connection between students and faculty. And there's some real dangers here in terms of what's actually going to be created here if we don't do it. The bottom line for all of this is finances. And my colleague talked about the way the government misconstrued the expenses in the university. What they didn't actually look at was, where the revenues come from. And the fact is, we have serious problems of revenues in this province across a whole series of things, but especially at post-secondary. We just are not funding enough. And that means we have to find revenue someplace. And if that means we have to start taxing, which Albertans hate to do, but that's what we're going to have to do. You get what you pay for. And if Albertans forget healthcare, all the other stuff, if you want good post-secondary, you're going to have to pay for it. Otherwise, students and faculty and staff are going to start to leave this province.
I think the question was something about graduate students and things like that. Well, I mean, from an economist perspective, graduate students are getting some training involved with their stipend, presumably. So that's one reason why they're paid less. I mean, I went through it. I think anybody with a PhD or a master's degree probably went through it as well. So there's a training component there. I think the fundamental problem, though, and why we have so many adjuncts right now is because there's been pressure in the system to produce a lot of what we call HQPs, these high quality personnel, which are master's students and PhD students in particular. And we haven't really thought a lot as institutions about what they do on the other end. Only about half of PhDs in Canada go on to academic positions. And so we're producing far too many of these people. And one of the reasons is because I think, as a labor economist, there's two labor markets. One's an internal labor market where we basically need graduate students to do all our marking and run our tutorials and labs and what have you. And then there's the external labor market, which we're flooding with a bunch of PhDs. And so university administrators say, oh, well, I want some flexibility. I want to hire tenure track people. You give somebody tenure, that's a lifetime commitment for the most part. And so from their perspective, and I think we have to be cognizant of that, is they're just doing the rational thing by hiring sessionals. Or contract employees or whatever the case may be. I'm not saying it's a good thing for building the community that everybody's talking about, which I certainly agree with, but I think we have to think about our responsibility to all of this in producing too many PhDs right now.
Thanks, Rick. Another question actually talks about really how do students get into post-secondary education? Most other provinces in Canada have free academic upgrading. However, Alberta doesn't offer this. Alberta only offers funding for very low to no income earners to possibly access and making more barriers to those who are working but not able to advance themselves due to financial constraints. Are there any thoughts of pushing for this change? So I know this is always a huge issue because there's so many people who do want to get into post-secondary education, but there's a barrier even before they can get in. And Alberta has got a terrible record in terms of supporting people with English as a second language or some of those other costs. Rachel, I'm going to toss this one over to you to see if you have any thoughts from a student perspective on those barriers that are out there and what we can do about it.
I myself, I didn't know that other provinces offered free upgrading. So that's interesting to hear. I do know that we offer free upgrading until I believe you're 19 or 20 in this province. If you entered a field or decided not to go into post-secondary, it's very unlikely that you are catching yourself before the age of 20 in order to go, and do that upgrading. Last year, the Alberta government did introduce a new grant. It's the Alberta Grant for Full-Time Students, I believe, which was meant to sort of help with this issue. But in its first year of operation, it ran out of funding before the fall semester even got underway. And so anyone who's looking to enter upgrading in the winter semester is not going to be eligible for this funding. I completely agree. I think this is something that we need to bring to the government with, especially since we have seen so much messaging since they have come into government about how, either you can be in oil and gas or you need to retrain. You've heard a lot of messaging about reskilling, retraining, literally in Alberta 2030 skills for jobs. But if we can't get people into these post-secondary institutions, whether it's a university, a college, or a polytechnic institute, we're not really going to be getting anywhere with retraining, reskilling people in this province. So I completely agree. I think that it's something we should be coming to the government with if they're asking many people in the province to re-enter post-secondary and reskill and retrain. But if they don't have the support to do so, how are they going to do that? I think it's a real issue, and I appreciate you raising that.
Thanks, Rachel. I know we actually turn away, last figures I saw were close to 18,000 people who apply and who are actually eligible to get into programs. And as the report outlined, really having the lowest post-secondary education system participation rate in Canada means that we really do need to expand the number of programs, spaces, et cetera, have more faculty and staff to support that as we transition our economy. I think all of these points are very interrelated. And the next question go ahead, jump in.
Well, we're just going to add a little bit more. I think that you raise a very good point, both with needing to upgrade, but funding enrollment. So over the pandemic, a lot of our universities saw our enrollment numbers significantly rise. And so a lot of our programs became much more competitive to enter. And so, students who, whether they are coming out of high school or however many years out, if they were expecting to be able to enter a program and then all of a sudden they're seeing, for example, our nursing program at the university that I'm at used to have about an 85% competitive average to enter. For this academic year, it was a 99% competitive average. And so, for example, if you're trying to enter, retrain, go become a nurse, but you can't afford to upgrade your grades, how are you going to do that and enter and contribute to the system? I think that's another really important piece of, if we're not funding enrollment growth, how many more people are going to have to continuously upgrade just to enter the system?
Well, and I think that speaks to one of the earlier comments about the need for parents to get engaged and involved. If you have a parent of a teenager, et cetera, coming through the system, and we know there's a demographic bubble, and Trevor and Rick talk about this in the report, and we're not expanding the system, then your children are most likely not going to be able to get into post-secondary education. It has to be as blunt as that to get people to mobilize to recognize how that's going to impact on them. We have another question. Mark Oakleby writes, it seems to me that non-academic staff cuts, much like the privatization of support workers in healthcare, often happen first because somehow it's assumed that the work they do isn't perceived as important. Those cuts function like trial balloons. If you can cut support staff without any outcry, then perhaps cutting other jobs won't be a problem either. How do we build more solidarity across the public sector so governments don't get away with this? Trevor?
Bill, I'll take a stab at it. Maybe it goes back to something I said before, but it seems to me that everybody involved in the system has to realize that we are part of a large community. The violence done to one group, we should all be concerned about. For example, I can talk about, and we've seen it at the University of Lethbridge over some years, wonderful support staff. And I know Rick and I both, much appreciate the caretakers, all the staff who work there. But over the years, we've seen significant cuts there, so that even some years ago, floors and places that used to be kept spotlessly clean, and of course, cleanliness is really important when you have valuable computers around, And all of a sudden, you'd find that there was no one around actually to do the work any longer, that no one showed up for weeks on end. And so there's dust bunnies collecting everywhere. That's a serious impediment to everybody in the place. But it's also unjust and it's unfair, so that the people who are left are then, and I think Mark's comment here is a good one, part of the way they get around it is because the few people who are left are convinced that they have to super exploit their labor to make up for the fact that so many people have now left, for fear that they also will lose their jobs. And it begins to filter right down the line that everybody feels that, they're unprotected and they're insecure in their jobs. This goes beyond universities, of course. It's endemic to our political system. But I do think that we need to, as a community, really realize that what is done to one group of, whether it's non-academic staff or what's done to students, is important to all of us. And so it begins again fundamentally with solidarity. One of the things that we talk about in the report, if only kind of in a hidden sense, is the real need to get back to a sense of bottom-up democracy here. And that's why, for example, we call for faculty associations, for general faculty councils throughout all of the post-secondary institutions. And we call for all of the people involved in post-secondary, non-academic staff, AUPE members, students, communities, parents, and faculty, to be much more involved in decision making. And it really begins with trying to break away from a top-down decision making process that is becoming more and more overwhelming in post-secondary and elsewhere.
If folks have been paying attention to the news, recently the government of Alberta came back to its workers with a new proposal. So they'd been in bargaining for quite some time. It came back with a new proposal that saw that their initial rollbacks, they took it off the table and instead offered a few increases. I think somewhere to around, I can't remember to the top of my head, maybe Kevin Barry would know, but like 1 or 3% or something around those lines. There's still debate over, how is that enough, especially in case of inflation down the line, which we'll see 4 to 6% in the next few years. That does set a precedence for other public sector unions that if this is possible, that it's possible for us, that we don't just take rollbacks. That's a sense of solidarity in that if you win, know that, if you lose, other people are losing, but if you win, you're also giving other people wins. So I think that is a helpful way of thinking about how can we really get outcries going when non-academic staff are hurt. Now, there's that sense of solidarity in which you support one another, but you're in different sectors. So you're not necessarily working with each other in decision-making and those things. So for non-academic staff on campus, what I think is a good solution is actually student-worker solidarity, because students and workers are so face-to-face together. So what that means is not only just demonstrating support for each other through press releases or talking and things like that, but to say, if students were like, we're doing this event, could you get involved? We could use your support, or we're facing this with the administration. Have you seen similar things? So, and same with staff as well, that we're doing this rally. Can we rely on students to come and those things? So I think that students worker solidarity is key in many other places in many other post-secondaries around the world that have seen successes in their struggles. So I think that is one really tangible way of getting that together.
I appreciate that you raised that, because it makes me think of some information that I recently learned. And a large portion of the non-academic staff at my institution are actually students who work in casual positions around the university. And I think reminding people that staff are not just, this invisible body of people that we don't know. They're your classmates. They're people that you come to school with every day. And reminding, people that you're not just supporting the person who prints your paper off when you need to hand it in at the print center. Like, this is your friend who sits beside you in econ. This is, the girl who sits in front of you in bio. Everyone is part of this community. And, even if you may not realize it, probably someone is being impacted, even if you're not realizing they are.
Thanks, Prachi and Rachel. One of the last questions here from Lori Edkin, who is very involved with the Parkland Institute. In fact, is doing a report herself on post-secondary education governance and stuff. So we're looking forward to working with her on that. She actually asked a question for CAFA, but I would like to generalize it and just have everyone do a final comment. Her question really is, will CAFA take a leadership role in organizing a PSCI strike against the UCP's policies? What will it take? The Strategic Advisory Council and other governance restructuring forthcoming reforms of the PSLA. And so we know that there's going to be changes happening this fall sitting of the legislature. I think Laurie's call is to say, what can CAFA do? But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, as Prachi and Rachel were saying, how do we work together and what sort of actions can we move forward? So, but I'm going to call upon you, Kevin, first, and then we'll just quickly go through and final comments around next steps and getting ready for the fall sitting of the legislature.
Yeah, CAFA, as its name implies, is a confederation of faculty associations. Really, we act together in the interests of our member associations. I have to bring Laurie's question back to the individual associations to start with before you can go forward. And that is that what are the wishes of the individual associations on this issue? That's something that's a work in progress on this. And the other thing is that once we come to agreement on actions that one might want to take with respect to, say, before the PSLA is changed in any way, it's of course alliances. In her question, I think I'd like to extend it to, of course, that means alliances with students and non-academic staff, etc. on this. That goes at individual institutions as well as across Alberta. So the idea of strike, there's lots of ways one can go at this. One of them is, of course, right at the legislature, in mass, for example, etc. So not everything has to be a strike. A strike is very complicated, especially under our current circumstances where we're already potentially contemplating job action through Alberta just simply because of the nature of what's happening at bargaining tables. So that's a key element. Some of these things could be included in some action like that, for example, across the province. These are things that are being discussed and developed. I don't think anybody right now is ready to do that simply because the discussions haven't gone to that degree.
Thank you, Kevin, in the chat back and forth. And people say, Prachi, your principles that you're putting forward are key that we need to be talking. Can you give us a very short just summation of where you think we should go next?
I think it's incumbent upon the leaderships of these unions, associations, confederations, just to get bold. We need to start seeing disruptive methods. The only way people start listening is if you bring things to a halt. If you don't let things function anymore, is when people suddenly can just cast you aside and not take you seriously. And the principles of that, how do you make that tangible? While I agree we need to build alliances, I would argue in many cases those alliances are there. We, faculty, students, and staff, as we discussed before, are already a community, and this community is under attack. There's no reason why alliances can't even be more built even more strongly as action is happening. So a very simple example, some students are organizing a student day of action at the University of Calgary, and they reached out to me to, hey, could you help me literally with logistics? And I'm like, yes, let's do this. Let me support you and making that happen. So I think what we need to do is actually become disruptive. And that includes things like job action, things like, like no favors, academic staff, non-academic staff, working only till 4:30, not staying late. It can mean things like reaching out to the more marginalized communities or cleaning staff and listening to what they have to say and how they can organize around day-to-day issues that they face in their work. And it also includes the reality of strike. It's something that not only do we not want to lose that moment, but we need to seriously start considering, what are we as a community? Are we those that sit around in committees and pass and argue over, passing over like certain legislation that we know GFC has already decided, Board of Governors has already decided they're going to pass? Or are we going to do what is unpopular and difficult and seriously consider strike action? And you don't need to be a union necessarily to strike. Students walk out all over the world for issues that they're facing. They're not employed, they're not employees, they're receiving a service, if anything, but they do walkouts. And I don't see why we can't apply some, like, strike is not a union specific, it is a legislative union specific thing. I understand that, but the principle of it is something that applies to anybody who is a worker and any group that is facing harm. So I think what we really need to do is not just consider, but honestly, at this point, just do. Like, you have to get disruptive, and you have to seriously stop waiting for conversation to lead to strike. Start that conversation now.
As far as students go, I think there's a lot of different appetites and energies across the province. But what some people may not realize is that, well, I am the chair of the Council of Alberta University Students. There are actually more than just one student advocacy organization in this province. And so over the last year, over the summer especially, we have been working to build closer coalitions with the other students associations across the province. What this has culminated in so far is CAUS, ABGPAC, which is the Alberta Graduates Political Action Council, and ASEC, which is the Alberta Students Executive Council. We have all joined together to plan something called the Alberta Student Congress. So this is something that we are planning as a biannual event, but we are trying to get students together to start thinking and working together about what they want the future of post-secondary to look like. I think a lot of students can get lost in just going to class every day, taking their notes, writing their tests, and just trying to get through their degrees. And you don't always, look up from your paper and think like, wow, this was really expensive. Should it be this expensive? And so what we're trying to do is really encourage students to think about their place in the system, that you're not just a pawn to be pushed through until you graduate, that you are, a member in this community who has the power to make change. And when all of us come together with that understanding that we can all make change, I think that we're going to see some amazing things. So as far as students are concerned, we're trying to make sure that students have the information and the confidence to step forward and start taking action, like Prachi is saying. And I really look forward to seeing what comes out of our Alberta Student Congress. It's actually this Saturday from 10 to 4. If anyone is interested in attending, you can look up AB Student Congress on Facebook, and we'd be happy to include you in our conversation about what we want the future of post-secondary to look like. I agree with Prachi. We all need to get together and really figure out what this is going to look like. Instead of just talking, it's time to act.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. And that really picks up on something that Mark has put into the chat about there's lots of people outside of post-secondary. He's talking about some of us that are retired in the community who want to be engaged. And so your offer to get people to come and engage is super important. So Rick, I'm going to throw it to you, and then I'll give it over to Trevor for his final words.
Yeah, I guess the question was, well, what can we do? And I mean, I don't think there's a lot of appetite in this province for striking, especially university professors in particular, perhaps the staff, et cetera. I mean, such is the nature of Alberta, I suppose. I think what we have to do is basically convince people that, this education is worthwhile. It's worth retaining our young people. It's worth economic development, especially in some of the smaller communities. I don't think things are going to change until some of these people realize, hey, wait a minute, my kid needs a 99, as somebody mentioned, to get into whatever program at whatever college or university. And then we're going to see an access problem. And that's when maybe some of the people that normally wouldn't support us will come out and support us. I think we just have to sort of convince the public that this is a real good investment. I mean, it's everything that's ever written in economics. I mean, one of the slides that we didn't show basically was the return on investment to a higher education. And it's hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 20-year career. It's only over a 20-year career, and that's all being taxed at least 10% in this province, right? And that's above what a high school graduate would make. And so those are the kind of arguments we sort of have to make. And I think we have to change the culture in Alberta. One of the big things, I mean, you look at the Maritimes and students still go there in big numbers, even though the jobs aren't really there to support a lot of the grads. And of course, they do end up leaving. But there's sort of that culture of post-secondary attendance. And we don't have that in Alberta. For years, especially for young males, we've had this thing called the oil patch, where people could go and make six-figure incomes and buy their toys and be quite happy and have good careers there. And that sort of mindset, I think, has to change. And that's something, I think we have to really think about. And
thanks, Rick. Trevor, final wrap-up comments and
I'm
say a
going
few
to
words.
try to, in some ways, I think, merge some of these recent comments here. Throughout, we've talked a lot, I think, and rightfully so, about solidarity of the communities within the university. And I think that is vitally important. But I think we also can't become so insular as to believe that we alone, in fact, we end up being unfortunately viewed sometimes as self-interested, as Rick said, particularly faculty members. The comments about we need to think and realize that we do have some supporters in the public. We need to reach out and get their support even more. But there's a large number of people in the public who don't quite understand what goes on in post-secondary and why it is important to them. But it is important to them. It's important to their children and to their grandchildren. And so as we do what we need to do to emphasize our case, and I think we should be certainly much more active and even aggressive with the government, we need at the same time to be constantly finding allies and supporters in the wider community, because it's only through that that ultimately the government will start to pay attention. Otherwise, they will continue to just poke at, point out to folks secondary, these people are, spoiled, whatever, especially when it comes to faculty. So this is a whole process of community engagement to change, as Rick says, the culture of this province so that people begin to think of post-secondary is vitally important to the kind of society that we want.
Thanks so much, Trevor. And we hope this event and the report that you and Rick wrote contributes to shifting that debate and mobilizing people and getting people to see and understand the big implications of the road that the UCP intends to take post-secondary education down. And certainly the next month or so, when they roll out the changes to the Post-Secondary Learning Act, we need people to be educated, informed, engaged on that. And we work with partner groups as well, like Public Interest Alberta, and I know a number of the organizations here have been working with Public Interest Alberta on their post-secondary education advocacy work. I see signs all around my neighborhood about the support and the importance of post-secondary education. So that's nice. You're up walking the walk, and there you see these signs and stuff. So that's the kind of thing that we just need to keep moving forward on. And so I want to thank everyone, including all our sponsors, the Confederation of Alberta Faculty Associations, the Council of Alberta University Students, the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, particularly Local 52, where Prachi's from University of Calgary, but across the province, the Non-Academic Staff Association, NASA, the U of A, and CUPE Alberta for supporting this event and supporting this research going forward. I also want a big shout out to my Parkland staff team, Sarah, Shar, and Austin for all the help getting this organized, etc. And thank you again to Trevor and Rick and Kevin, Rachel, and Prachi for speaking tonight. We do have our conference coming up. Please remember in the next couple of days to go to the Parkland Institute conference website for the 19th to the 21st of November and sign up. And there's going to be some amazing opportunities to engage with others on political action and building the future that we need, which is the theme of it. So again, thank you very much. Have a good night, and we'll see you at the next time.